had always liked hiking. Not the fancy kind with expensive gear and a group of people, but the type where you grab an old backpack, throw in some water, food, a flashlight, and head out alone. In 2013, I was 27 and living in Oregon, working a job that drained me. Hiking was my break from people, from computers, from phones that never stopped buzzing. That summer, I decided to try something harder than my usual weekend trails. There was a place I had read about in an old outdoor magazine, Columbia Gorge, not the tourist parts, but deeper into the less marked trails, where cliffs leaned over the river and the forest grew thick. The magazine warned that the area wasn't maintained well, that paths faded and maps didn't always match what you'd see. But that's what drew me in. I wanted something raw, something that made me feel far from the world. I planned a full-day hike. Start early, push past the marked trail, loop around a ridge I saw on a map, and come back before evening. The morning I set out was cool, the air damp from rain the night before. My boots left prints in the mud. The trees still dripped water, and when I brushed past branches, cold drops slid down my neck. I parked my old Honda near a turnout off the highway, checked my backpack, 2 bottles of water, jerky, granola, a cheap compass, a folded paper map, my phone with barely any service bars, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I thought it was enough. The trail started easy. A dirt path wound through ferns and moss-covered trunks. I felt alive walking there, breathing deep, hearing nothing but birds and the distant sound of water. The ground was soft, and the air smelled green, earthy, wet. After about an hour, the trail grew steeper, climbing up the ridge. The magazine had said the view from the top was worth the push. My thighs burned, but I kept going, thinking of the open view I'd have once I broke past the trees. By late morning, I reached the top. The forest opened and the world spread below me. The Columbia River shone silver in the light. Cliffs dropped sharp to the water, and ridges stretched into the distance like waves frozen in stone. I stood there, sweating, chest heaving, staring at the beauty. I ate some jerky, washed it down with water, and studied my map. That's when I decided to try for the loop, instead of turning back the way I came. The map showed a faint dotted line, a trail curving along the ridge and down into a lower section of forest that would connect back to where I started. It looked simple on paper. What I didn't know then was how misleading those dotted lines could be. The ridge trail was less obvious than I expected. At first it looked like a deer path, narrow and broken, but I followed it. The ground sloped sharply to my left, so I kept careful footing. Loose rocks shifted under me sometimes, sending small slides down the slope. I slowed, focused on each step, telling myself I'd hit the lower forest soon where it would flatten. But the farther I went, the harder the trail was to see. Sometimes it disappeared into brush and I'd have to guess where it picked up again. My compass needle spun uselessly every time I pulled it out, twitching as if the ridge itself messed with it. Still, I thought I was fine. I could always turn back if it got too rough. An hour passed, maybe more. Clouds rolled in, covering the sun, and the air turned cooler. The path narrowed until I couldn't tell if it was even a path anymore. At one point, I slid on loose dirt and dropped to one knee. My heart raced as I caught myself. Looking down, the slope seemed endless, dropping into tangled trees far below. That's when the first sharp thought hit me. Maybe I should turn back. But I looked over my shoulder and saw nothing that looked like a clear return. The way back seemed just as unclear as the way forward. I told myself the lower forest couldn't be far. I pressed on. By mid-afternoon, I reached a section where the ridge split. I guessed wrong and followed the steeper branch down. At first it seemed fine, but soon the slope grew sharper, the ground looser. I grabbed at roots and branches to steady myself. My boots slipped on wet leaves. I slid several feet at one point, tearing my palms open as I clawed at the ground to stop myself. When I finally reached flat ground, I realized I was no longer on any trail at all. Around me was thick forest, the kind where trees stand tight together and the undergrowth grabs at your legs. I tried to find the ridge line again, but couldn't. All I saw were trees and more trees. I took out my phone, no service. My map didn't help. The dotted lines made sense on paper, but nothing around me matched. For the first time, a heavy weight settled in my chest. I wasn't sure where I was. I picked a direction, hoping it would lead me toward the highway or river. I walked fast, trying not to think about how the light was already starting to fade. Every step cracked twigs, rustled leaves. I kept glancing behind me, feeling like something was watching. I knew it was only my nerves, but it grew worse the longer I walked. Hours slipped by. The forest darkened. The shadows grew thick until the trees looked like walls around me. My legs ached. My water was nearly gone, and I hadn't seen a sign of trail or person since midday. When dusk fell, I accepted what I didn't want to. I'd be spending the night out there. I cleared a small spot under a cedar, brushed leaves aside, and sat down. The ground was cold and damp. I wrapped my arms around myself and listened. The forest at night is alive with sounds. Snaps, rustles, distant calls. Every noise made me tense, imagining animals creeping closer. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by sudden snaps that jolted me awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, not heavy, but measured. My heart pounded as I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound faded, and I told myself it was just branches shifting. Still, I barely slept after that. When morning came, gray and cold, I forced myself up. My stomach growled. I chewed the last of my granola and rationed the final sips of water. My throat was dry already. I started walking again, trying to follow the slope downward. Rivers usually lay lower, I thought, and if I found water, I could follow it to people. Hours passed. My legs dragen. My lips cracked. Then I heard it, a faint rush of water. Hope surged through me. I stumbled toward the sound until I reached a stream. Clear water rushed over rocks. I dropped to my knees and drank until my stomach hurt. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. Streams don't always lead where you want. I decided to follow it anyway, figuring it had to flow somewhere. The day grew hotter, the forest thicker. I slipped often on slick rocks along the stream, soaking my boots. My socks squished, blisters forming. At one point, I slipped fully and hit my shin on a stone so hard I nearly blacked out. The pain throbbed with every step, but I pushed on. By late afternoon, the stream split. I chose the larger branch, but it soon narrowed into nothing. I cursed out loud, slamming my fist against a tree. My throat burned with thirst again. That night was worse than the first. My leg hurt badly, and my stomach twisted in hunger. I shivered on the cold ground, unable to find comfort. My flashlight flickered weakly, batteries dying. I turned it off to save what was left. The dark pressed in thick, suffocating. The third morning, I could barely stand. My shin had swollen, and each step was agony. I leaned on a stick as a crutch and forced myself forward. Hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. Then, sometime in the late afternoon, I saw it. Faint lines cutting across the ground. Not a full trail, but something human-made. I followed it, heart racing, until it widened into an old logging road. Relief flooded me so hard I nearly cried. I limped along it, praying it would lead somewhere. It did. After what felt like forever, the road opened onto a gravel turnout. Tire tracks. The sight nearly broke me. I dropped to my knees, laughing and crying. Soon after, a pickup truck came down the road. The driver stopped, eyes wide as he saw me. Mud-covered, limping, face sunken. He drove me out, back to civilization. I survived, but the memory of those nights still clings to me. The hunger, the thirst, the sound of something moving in the dark. I had gone out looking for peace in nature, and instead I found how quickly it can strip you down to nothing. I never hiked alone like that again. I had been planning this trip for weeks, maybe months, without even realizing how much thought I was putting into it. The idea had first crossed my mind one night when I couldn't sleep, scrolling through maps and hiking blogs, reading about long trails tucked deep inside areas most people never even thought to step foot in. I wanted something quiet, away from the noise of the city, away from my phone buzzing every other minute. I wanted air that didn't taste like exhaust, and I wanted to test myself. I wasn't young anymore. 32 felt like the kind of age where your body still worked but gave you hints of the things it would take away later. My knees sometimes clicked when I went downstairs. My lower back stiffened in the mornings. Nothing serious, just enough to remind me I wasn't 20. That was part of why I chose a trail I knew wasn't easy. I wanted something that forced me to pay attention, to feel like I was actually doing something out there. I read about the Ridgeway Loop, a 32-mile stretch through the northern mountains, not far from Washington State's border. The posts I found online said it was rugged, isolated, not many hikers at all once you left the first few miles. It wound through pine forests, crossed rivers that swelled high in spring, and cut close to cliffs where the wind could push you sideways if you weren't careful. I took a Friday off work, packed my bag Thursday night with too much energy to sleep, and drove out before the sun came up. My car was filled with the smell of new gear, fresh nylon from the backpack, plastic from water bottles that had never been used, faint rubber from the soles of boots that had only touched pavement a few times for breaking in. It was almost 2 hours of winding roads before I reached the small gravel lot that marked the trailhead. By then, the sun had climbed just enough to push light across the tops of the trees, turning the mist silver. I parked and sat for a while, engine off, the sudden silence filling the car in a way that made me hesitate. No voices, no cars rushing by, no hum of a city around me, just the faint creak of trees shifting in the breeze and the sharp cries of birds waking up. For a second, I wondered if this was a mistake. Not the hike itself, but the idea of doing it alone. I told people at work that I was going out for the weekend, left details with a friend, but the truth was I hadn't wanted company. I wanted the solitude more than anything, even if it carried risks I couldn't completely ignore. The air was colder than I expected when I opened the door. I stepped out, stretched, and stood staring at the sign nailed to the post at the start of the trail. Ridgeway Loop, 32 miles moderate to difficult, unmaintained sections. Beneath it, someone had carved initials into the wood, then crossed them out with a knife. The surface was splintered, the paint faded, but the arrow still pointed forward into a dark path swallowed by trees. I shouldered my pack and started walking. The first hour was easy, almost too easy. The path was wide, packed dirt and gravel, clearly worn down by many boots. Ferns grew thick on either side, their leaves wet with dew brushing my pants as I passed. A stream ran alongside the trail for a while, trickling over smooth stones, catching light in flashes. I found my rhythm quickly. Steady steps, breathing in through my nose, out through my mouth, listening to my boots crunch with each placement. After about 3 miles, the trail narrowed. Roots cut across it like black ropes, and the ground turned soft from patches of mud. The trees crowded closer overhead, branches bending until the sky disappeared in a ceiling of needles. The air smelled different here, heavier with resin and damp earth. Every once in a while, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. A squirrel darting, a bird shifting. I kept glancing back too, out of habit more than worry. The trail behind me always looked darker, quieter, as if it sealed itself off after I passed. I stopped around noon to eat. A protein bar, some dried fruit, water that was still cold from the morning. I sat on a fallen log, looking at the thin shafts of light that pierced through the canopy. Everything was so still, even my chewing sounded too loud. I realized how used to background noise I was, how much silence pressed in here. When I stood to continue, I noticed something odd. On the ground, just off the trail, were shoe prints. At first I thought they were mine, but the treads didn't match my boots. These were flatter, smaller, maybe even barefoot impressions near the edges where the mud was softer. I crouched down, tracing them with my eyes. They led deeper into the trees, away from the marked path. No blaze marks, no sign that a trail branched off there. Just prints heading into the undergrowth and vanishing. I felt a flicker in my stomach, something between curiosity and unease. It wasn't impossible for someone else to be out here, but barefoot, or in thin shoes that barely left tread. And why step off the main trail at that point, with no sign of a fork? I shook my head and kept moving, telling myself not to linger. By mid-afternoon, the ground climbed sharply. The forest thinned, giving way to rockier terrain. I had to slow down, planting my feet carefully to keep balance. Sweat rolled down my back, soaked into the straps of my pack. My thighs burned, and every step felt like a small fight against gravity. But then I reached a ridge where the trees broke, and the view opened wide. Mountains rolled out in the distance, their tops still holding onto snow. Valleys cut between them, dark green carpets stretching for miles. I pulled off my pack, dropped it onto the dirt, and stood breathing hard while staring at it all. That was the moment I thought, this is worth it. Every ache, every doubt, it felt small compared to the expanse below me. I stayed too long up there, letting the minutes slip. When I finally checked the time, it was close to 4. Shadows were already stretching, sliding long fingers across the slopes. I knew I had at least 2 more miles to reach the spot I'd planned to camp, so I strapped the pack back on and pushed forward. The trail narrowed again, hugging the side of the ridge. Loose rocks skittered beneath my boots, dropping down into steep slopes that disappeared into trees below. I kept close to the wall, heart jumping each time my foot slipped an inch. Wind pushed harder here too, sharp gusts that tugged at my pack and whistled past my ears. I bent forward, lowered my center of gravity, and kept moving. By the time I reached the small flat clearing I'd marked on the map, my legs felt hollow. I dropped my pack and pulled out the tent. Setting it up took longer than it should have, hands clumsy, poles catching. When it finally stood, a squat dome in the dirt, I sat inside and let out a long breath. The light outside was fading fast, the air turning cold again. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove. Instant rice, jerky torn into pieces, mixed together with a packet of sauce. It tasted better than it should have, eaten with shaking hands while wrapped in my sleeping bag. The warmth of food filled me, and for a while I relaxed, the sounds of the forest settling into a rhythm outside. Crickets, rustling branches, the occasional cry of something farther away. But then, as I lay back with my headlamp dimmed, I heard something different, a sound that didn't fit the background pattern. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They crunched on gravel, shifted across loose dirt. Not an animal bounding or scurrying, but weight pressing down with each careful step. My body went rigid, every sense straining. The steps stopped just outside, maybe 10 feet from my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The air felt suddenly thin, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I waited. Nothing. The steps didn't continue. They didn't retreat either. Just silence. Minutes dragged on, though it felt like hours, until finally the forest sounds crept back. Crickets again. The wind through branches. I stayed awake long after, listening, my body stiff, until exhaustion pulled me down. When I woke in the gray light of morning, the ground outside the tent was disturbed. A single barefoot print pressed into the dirt, toes splayed, heel deep, and it wasn't mine. I never thought the forest could feel so heavy. I had hiked plenty of trails before, but never this far out, never this deep where the paths grew faint and the air seemed to hold on to every sound. It was the summer of 2016. I was 26, and I thought I needed to prove something to myself. That was the reason I took on the hike alone in the first place. Most people wouldn't go out into the Olympic National Forest without a friend, but I told myself I was prepared. I had my pack, my map, my water, a tent, and more than enough food. I figured that was enough. The first day was easy. The trail was well marked, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The trees stood tall and close together, but sunlight broke through in spots, giving the ground that broken gold look. I remember thinking how quiet it was, though. No voices, no traffic, not even the distant sound of planes. Just the steady rhythm of my boots on dirt and the faint rustle of the canopy above. By the afternoon, I had already put more than 12 miles behind me. My shoulders ached from the pack straps, but I told myself the soreness would fade. I stopped near a creek to refill my bottle, the water running cold and clear. I sat there for a long time, eating some trail mix, stretching out my legs, just listening. That was when I first noticed how different the silence felt out here compared to the trails closer to town. It wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. When I finally made camp that evening, I chose a flat patch of ground surrounded by trees, not far from the water. I pitched my small tent, cooked some dehydrated pasta on my little stove, and wrote a few notes in my journal. Nothing unusual, nothing that set off alarms. But even then, as I crawled into my sleeping bag and turned off the headlamp, I felt it, that weight pressing down, like the dark itself had a body and it was leaning in close. I woke up twice that night. The first time I thought I heard footsteps. They were soft, muffled by the pine needles, but steady, moving just beyond the thin nylon walls of my tent. My body froze. I listened until my ears hurt from straining. After a while, the sound stopped, and I convinced myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. Something normal. I eventually fell back asleep. The second time I woke up, it was dead silent. No crickets, no wind, not even the trickle of the creek. Just complete stillness. I lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, waiting for something, anything, to break it. Nothing did. When I finally checked my watch, it was 3:17 a.m. I didn't fall asleep again after that. I just waited for daylight, telling myself I'd feel better once the sun came up. Morning came slow. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and every sound, the snapping of a twig, the shuffle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. I packed quickly, barely touching my breakfast, and pushed back onto the trail. I told myself it was just nerves. I told myself I was tired, that the forest always played tricks when you were alone. But even as I moved forward, deeper into the woods, I kept feeling it. That sense that something was behind me, just far enough back that I couldn't see it. I had been planning that hike for weeks. It was the summer of 2014, late July, when the heat during the day was heavy but the evenings dipped into cool air that made it easier to keep moving. I was 28 then, and though I had been on dozens of short trails and day hikes before, I had decided I wanted something longer, something that stretched me a little beyond what I was used to. The trail I picked was about 16 miles, looping through a section of the North Cascades in Washington. I thought I could handle it with a single overnight stop, carrying my pack with food, water, and a lightweight tent. I started early, just after sunrise, when the sky was still pale and the dew on the grass made the air smell sharp and clean. The first few miles felt almost too easy. The ground was soft, the trail wide, and the only sounds were my boots pressing against dirt and the occasional scatter of a bird moving through the trees. My pack felt comfortable, strapped tight against my back. I remember thinking that I could have gone farther than 16 miles if I wanted. That thought, in hindsight, makes me almost laugh at myself now. By mid-morning, the trail grew narrower and rockier. I had to pay more attention to where I stepped. The trees thickened overhead, blocking most of the sunlight, and the air cooled. At first it felt good, but I started to notice how quiet everything was. There were no other hikers, no voices in the distance, not even the usual background hum of insects. It was the kind of silence that made you hear your own heartbeat, your own breath, the swish of fabric from your pants. I told myself it was just because I had chosen a less popular route. I had read online that most people preferred the neighboring trail since it offered more scenic viewpoints. I thought I was clever for picking the quieter option, the one where I could be alone with nature. But as the hours went on, I began to realize that being alone out there didn't feel the way I thought it would. Around mile 6, the trail began to climb. The incline wasn't steep, but it went on for so long that my calves burned and my shoulders ached from the pack. I stopped to rest on a flat rock and drank from my water bottle. I noticed then how different the forest looked at that elevation. The trees were taller, thinner, and they swayed slightly with the wind, making soft, groaning noises. I sat there for a few minutes, chewing on a granola bar, until I caught myself glancing over my shoulder again and again, like I expected to see someone behind me. There was no one. I pushed on. The sun had moved higher by then, slipping through gaps in the branches, but the light never fully reached the ground. Everything looked washed in a dim green filter. I kept telling myself I'd stop for lunch at the 8-mile point, where the map promised a small clearing with a creek. It was supposed to be a nice rest spot. I kept picturing it in my mind, as though focusing on it would somehow bring it closer. When I finally got there, the clearing was smaller than I expected. The creek was little more than a narrow trickle of water weaving between rocks. Still, I welcomed the break. I dropped my pack and crouched near the creek to refill my bottle with my filter. As I pumped water, I felt that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you think someone's watching you. I stood and scanned the trees. Nothing, just green, gray, and the slow shimmer of water. I shook it off and forced myself to eat another granola bar. The next stretch was harder. The trail narrowed even more, winding upward with sharp switchbacks. My legs burned, and sweat soaked into the straps of my pack. I began to regret packing so much food. I told myself I might get hungrier than usual and brought extra energy bars, but now the weight felt unnecessary. Every time I shifted, I could feel the straps cutting into my shoulders. It must have been around mile 10 when I first noticed the prints. They weren't human, not boot prints, at least. At first I thought they belonged to a large dog, but they were too big, too spread out. The soil was dry in places, so the impressions weren't clear, but the deeper ones looked like paw marks pressed hard into mud. I bent down to examine them, brushing leaves aside. For distinct pads, sharp edges. Cougar, maybe, or a black bear. I stood quickly, heart thumping. The tracks weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. The edges hadn't crumbled, which meant whatever left them had been there recently. I forced myself to keep walking, faster this time, glancing back now and then. The forest seemed darker the higher I went. Even when the sun was still out, the light barely made it through the thick canopy. My phone had no service, but I checked it anyway, more out of nervous habit than anything else. The screen was blank, no bars. I shoved it back into my pocket and kept moving. By mile 12, I was exhausted. My legs felt like lead, and my shirt clung to me with sweat. I had planned to camp around mile 13, where there was supposed to be a flat section suitable for pitching a tent. But the further I went, the less sure I became that I'd find it. The trail twisted through tight patches of trees and over roots that clawed out of the dirt like veins. I stumbled more than once, catching myself on nearby trunks. The silence grew heavier. Even the birds had vanished. It was so quiet that when I dropped my water bottle, the clatter against a rock sounded like a gunshot. I picked it up quickly, my pulse racing. My mouth was dry, but I didn't take another sip. Instead, I kept my head up, eyes darting left and right, scanning the trees. It was then that I saw it. Not movement, but the aftermath of it. A branch swung slightly, as if something large had just brushed past it. The leaves shivered in the still air. My gut twisted. I froze, gripping the straps of my pack so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't hear footsteps, no snapping twigs, nothing. But the branch was still moving, swaying back and forth. I forced myself to take slow, steady breaths. If it was a cougar, I remembered reading somewhere you should never run. Running triggers them. You're supposed to look big, make noise. But standing there, alone, I couldn't bring myself to shout into the silence. The thought of my own voice echoing through the empty woods felt worse somehow. After what felt like an eternity, I began moving again. My steps were quick but careful. I kept my eyes on the trail, though every instinct screamed to keep checking behind me. When I reached the flat spot around mile 13, I didn't feel relief. Instead, I felt cornered. The space was open but surrounded tightly by trees, as though the forest pressed in on every side. I hesitated, staring at the dirt patch where other hikers had probably set up camp before. It looked almost too perfect, like a stage waiting for an actor. Still, I had no choice. My legs couldn't carry me farther. I dropped my pack and forced myself to set up the tent. My hands shook as I slid the poles together and pulled the fabric taut. Every sound I made, the rip of Velcro, the zip of the tent flap, seemed too loud, as though it might draw something closer. When it was done, I crawled inside and sat cross-legged on my sleeping pad. The walls of the tent felt paper-thin, useless against whatever was out there. I pulled out my small camping stove, boiled water for instant noodles, and ate in silence, every bite sticking in my throat. Night fell fast. The forest went black in minutes, as if someone had dropped a heavy curtain over it. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling of the tent. My headlamp was off to save batteries, and the dark pressed in on all sides. That was when I heard it. A sound outside. Not branches swaying, not leaves falling. A deliberate sound. Slow steps in the dirt, moving just beyond the thin wall of the tent. I had always liked hiking alone. There was something about being out in the open air with nothing but trees, dirt, and the sound of my own breathing that gave me a kind of calm. I didn't tell many people when I went on my hikes. Sometimes I just packed a bag and left, not saying much about where I was going. That fall in 1998, I had just turned 27, and I was living in northern Colorado. The days were cool, the air was crisp, and I had a few days off from work. I decided I would spend one of those days hiking a trail I hadn't tried before, one that ran deep into the Roosevelt National Forest. It wasn't the most popular trail. I had read about it in an old guidebook I'd picked up at a secondhand store. The book mentioned that the trail wasn't well maintained anymore, but it was supposed to lead up towards some beautiful views over the foothills. The name of the trail was Bear Creek Ridge, though from what I gathered, there hadn't been any reports of actual bears in the area for a long time. Still, the name sat in the back of my mind as I loaded my backpack that morning. I packed what I thought I needed: water bottles, a couple of protein bars, a small first aid kit, my pocket knife, a flashlight, an old map, and a thin jacket. I didn't think I would need much else. I figured I'd be out for most of the day, back home before dark. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from my apartment. I left just after sunrise, my car rattling along the winding mountain road until I reached the small gravel turnout where the trail started. There wasn't another car in sight. That didn't bother me much, actually. I preferred it that way. I liked being alone, not having to nod at strangers or make small talk as I passed them. The trail started off easy, winding through pines that smelled sharp and fresh in the cool morning air. The ground was damp with dew, and the dirt clung to the soles of my boots. I walked steadily, my breath coming slow and even. I could hear the distant sound of water trickling somewhere downhill, and every so often a squirrel would dart across the path ahead of me, its tail flicking before it vanished into the brush. The first hour was peaceful. I felt strong, awake, and good. The forest was quiet, with only the occasional bird call breaking the stillness. I stopped once to take a sip of water and adjust the straps on my backpack. That was when I noticed how quiet everything had become. The sound of birds had faded, and even the breeze seemed to have stilled. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. The trail grew steeper as I climbed, twisting along the side of the ridge. Roots jutted from the dirt, and I had to watch my step carefully. I liked the challenge. My muscles burned in a good way, and sweat trickled down my back under the straps of my pack. The trees grew closer together, and the sunlight thinned until the forest seemed dim even though it was barely mid-morning. I kept moving, following the faint marks of the trail. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled more than once on loose rocks. At one point, I noticed a set of deep scratches on the trunk of a tree to my right. They looked old but wide, as if something with strong claws had raked across it years ago. I stared for a few seconds, then turned and kept walking. By late morning, I reached a small clearing where the trees opened up, and I could see across the valley. The view was incredible, miles of rolling hills stretching out, dotted with dark patches of forest. I stood there for a while, breathing in the cold air, letting the wind brush against my face. For a moment, I felt like everything was worth it. I ate one of the protein bars, washed it down with water, and decided to keep pushing up the trail. That was my first mistake. The path narrowed the farther I went, until it was barely more than a strip of dirt between rocks and brush. Branches scraped against my arms as I walked, and I noticed how overgrown everything seemed. It was clear that not many people came up this way anymore. I started to wonder if maybe the guidebook had been right. Maybe the trail had fallen out of use. But by then, I had already gone too far to turn around without feeling like I had wasted the day. The climb grew harder. I had to pull myself up by tree trunks at times, my boots slipping on loose dirt. My legs ached, but I told myself it was all part of the hike. I checked my watch. It was just past noon. I figured I still had plenty of time to make it back before dark. The trail curved sharply, and I found myself standing on a narrow ridge. The drop on my left side was steep, falling away into a thick tangle of trees far below. I kept my eyes on the ground, moving carefully, planting each step with caution. My throat felt dry, and I sipped more water. The sun was still high, but clouds had started to gather, covering the sky in patches of gray. It was there, on that ridge, that I first felt it, the sense that I was being watched. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck rising. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I turned slowly, scanning the trees behind me, but saw nothing. My heart thudded in my chest. I told myself it was just nerves, the natural effect of being alone in the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept moving, faster now, my boots crunching against the dirt. I tried not to look over my shoulder, but every few steps I did anyway. Each time, there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and silence. At one point, I thought I heard something, a branch snapping somewhere behind me. I stopped dead, holding my breath. The sound didn't come again. I forced myself to keep walking. By the time I realized how far I had gone, the sky had grown darker. Thick clouds rolled in, and the air turned cooler. I cursed under my breath, realizing I had pushed too far. My legs felt heavy, and my water bottle was already nearly empty. I checked the map, trying to figure out where the trail looped back, but the lines on the paper were faded and confusing. I decided to turn back. The trail looked different on the way down. Shadows stretched across it, and I noticed things I hadn't before. Rocks I didn't remember, trees that seemed closer together. I tried to retrace my steps carefully, but soon I began to doubt myself. More than once, I came to a fork that I didn't remember seeing earlier. I picked one path, hoping it was right, only to end up at a dead end. The forest pressed in around me, darker with each passing minute. My throat was dry, my stomach ached with hunger, and my legs trembled with fatigue. The uneasy feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. I thought I heard footsteps once, faint but steady, echoing mine. I spun around, my flashlight in hand, but the trail behind me was empty. I moved faster, my breath ragged, sweat stinging my eyes. Branches whipped at my arms, and thorns scratched my legs. At one point, I tripped on a root and went sprawling forward, my palms scraping against the dirt and stones. I lay there for a moment, breathing hard, before forcing myself up. Blood trickled from a cut on my hand. Panic set in when I realized I didn't recognize anything anymore. The trail had vanished into brush, and I was standing in the middle of trees that all looked the same. I turned in a slow circle, my flashlight beam cutting across trunks and leaves, but nothing looked familiar. The forest was dead silent, except for my breathing. I never used to think much about hiking alone. I had done it plenty of times before. I liked the silence, the way my head cleared when I was surrounded by nothing but trees, dirt, wind, and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Back in 2017, when I was 27 years old, I thought of myself as careful enough. I wasn't reckless, not really. I brought water, I told people where I was going, I checked the weather before leaving. But the day I decided to take that trail outside of Bend, Oregon, I made the mistake of thinking I was in complete control. Looking back, it was one of those decisions that feels harmless at the time, but grows darker in memory the more you replay it. It was late August. The air was dry, the sun sharp in a way that made the dirt trails almost glare back at you. I'd been in Oregon for only a couple of months, staying with an old college friend while I tried to figure out my next steps in life. I was in between jobs, restless, and the hikes were something to anchor myself. That morning, I woke before 6, restless and unable to sleep. I'd been looking at maps the night before, picking out trails that weren't as popular, places where I could walk for hours without passing families with dogs or kids yelling. Solitude was the point for me. The trail I settled on wasn't an official tourist hike. It was one of those smaller ones you find mentioned in half-forgotten blogs or on message boards where people swap tips. Supposedly, it led to an old fire lookout that hadn't been maintained in years. Some people said it was still standing, some said it had collapsed. Either way, I wanted to see it. The directions weren't clear, and that should have been the first red flag. It wasn't on the main hiking apps. The only instructions I could find came from a guy who said he'd hiked it back in 2012. 5 years earlier. A lot can change in 5 years, especially in the forest. I loaded my backpack, 2 bottles of water, some trail mix, jerky, a flashlight, a small knife, and a hoodie tied around the straps. I told my friend I'd be out most of the day, probably back by evening. He was still half asleep and just waved. By 7, I was driving down the cracked asphalt road that led to the dirt parking lot at the base of the ridge. Only 2 other cars sat there, both covered in dust, like they hadn't been moved in a while. The lot was silent, no other hikers starting early. I didn't think too hard about it. The first few miles were normal, almost pleasant. The trailhead looked marked once, years ago, but the wooden sign was weathered, the letters faint. The dirt was hard-packed from occasional use, but weeds pushed up through cracks. I walked with steady steps, feeling the warmth of the sun on the back of my neck, my boots kicking up little puffs of dust with each stride. The air smelled of pine sap and dry grass. Every so often, a gust of wind moved through the trees, shaking loose dry needles that floated down around me. The trail climbed gradually, winding back and forth up the ridge. I paced myself, drinking a little water every so often. Hours passed easily. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen a single other person, not even from a distance. That was unusual even for these smaller trails. Usually, you at least crossed paths with someone heading back down. Still, I told myself that was a good thing. I had the whole place to myself. By late morning, the trail became rougher. Fallen branches blocked parts of it, and in some areas the dirt looked washed out, leaving small gullies that forced me to step carefully. I followed what looked like the path, though sometimes I had to guess. The deeper I went, the more the forest pressed in. The trees grew closer, their trunks black with age, the underbrush thicker. The sound of the wind faded. It was just me, my breathing, and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. Then I noticed something strange. About 4 miles in, I passed what looked like an old jacket tangled in the branches of a bush. It was faded red, the fabric shredded. The kind of thing you'd expect to see in a place people might camp. But there was no campsite around, no sign of a fire pit or gear. Just the jacket. It must have been there for years, bleached by the sun and torn by weather. I kept walking, but it left a dull unease in the back of my mind. Not long after, I found another thing. A single hiking boot lying on its side near the trail. The leather was cracked, the sole peeling. It didn't look brand new, but it didn't look decades old either. There was no sign of its pair. I stopped and looked around. Nothing moved. The forest was still. I remember thinking, maybe someone dropped it, maybe it had been carried here by an animal. But what kind of animal carries a boot? I kept going slower now, alert. My shoulders felt tense, my eyes scanning the trees. The trail curved uphill, steeper now, the dirt loose under my boots. My calves burned with effort. Sweat dampened the back of my shirt. I took a long drink of water, sitting on a fallen log to rest. The silence pressed on me. I realized how long it had been since I'd heard any birdsong. Usually, the forest was alive with noise, chirps, rustles, the buzz of insects. Here, it was nothing but the faint whisper of wind high in the trees. I stood and kept walking, even though my gut told me something was off. I told myself I was being dramatic, letting my imagination run wild. It was just an abandoned trail. Things get left behind. Boots, jackets, trash. Nothing unusual. By early afternoon, I reached a clearing where the trail seemed to split in two. One path went left, overgrown with weeds but faintly visible. The other went right, looking more recently used, though not by much. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. I thought about turning back. I'd already been walking for hours, but the idea of reaching the old fire lookout pulled at me. I chose the right path. The trail narrowed, winding through denser forest. Branches scratched at my arms. The ground sloped downward, unexpected, making me question if I was still on the right route. After maybe half a mile, I noticed the smell. Faint at first, then stronger. A sour, rotting odor, heavy in the still air. I froze, my stomach tightening. I knew that smell. It was the smell of something dead. I moved slowly, scanning the ground. At first I saw nothing. Then, just off the trail, in a small hollow between tree roots, I saw the remains of a deer. Its body was half decayed, the ribcage exposed, fur matted and torn. The skull was tilted at an odd angle, empty sockets staring. I swallowed hard, breathing shallowly through my mouth. Dead animals weren't unusual in the wild, but this one looked strange. The legs seemed twisted, like they'd been broken. The ground around it was disturbed, the dirt pressed down in uneven patterns, as if something heavy had moved around it. I backed away and kept walking, faster now, wanting distance between myself and that hollow. But the smell seemed to linger in my nostrils even after it was gone. My thoughts ran wild. Cougars, bears, wolves. I knew they were possible out here. I hadn't brought bear spray, just the small knife in my bag. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving. The trail climbed again, steeper than before. My legs ached. The light shifted as clouds gathered overhead, dulling the brightness of the day. I checked my watch, past 3. I should have turned back then, but I told myself I was close. Maybe another mile. The thought of quitting so close to the goal felt wrong. That's when I heard it. A sound behind me, faint but distinct. The crunch of a footstep on dry leaves. My body went cold. I stopped walking, my breath caught in my chest. The forest was still. No wind, no birds, nothing. I turned slowly, scanning the trail. Nothing but trees, stretching into shadows. I waited, listening so hard my ears rang. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, another sound. Off the trail this time, maybe 20 feet into the trees. A crack, like a branch snapping. I gripped the straps of my backpack, forcing myself to breathe. Maybe it was an animal. Probably an animal. But every hair on my arms stood on end. I backed away a few steps, then turned and started walking faster. My heart pounded, the sound of my own boots too loud in the silence. I resisted the urge to run. Running would be worse. Running would draw attention. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. I never planned for the hike to go the way it did. It was early October of 2016. I had just turned 24, and I wanted to clear my head. I was living in Denver at the time, fresh out of college, working a job that I hated but couldn't afford to quit. I didn't drink much, I didn't go out much, and I thought maybe some time alone in the mountains would help me get rid of the restless, grinding feeling I carried around every day. I had gone on hikes before, but always short ones, marked trails that plenty of other people used. This time, I wanted something different. I searched online and picked a trail a little out of the way, something that wasn't on the usual tourist lists but still looked manageable. It was supposed to be about 9 miles round trip, with some elevation gain but nothing extreme. The description said it wound through some old forest, then up to a ridge with a wide view of the valley below. That was all I needed to read. I left my apartment around 7 in the morning. The sun was just coming up, the air cold enough to see my breath. I had packed a small backpack the night before. Water, granola bars, a light jacket, a flashlight, a folding knife, and a first aid kit. My phone was fully charged, and I had a small external battery pack. I figured that was enough. I wore hiking boots I'd bought secondhand, jeans, and a thick hoodie. The drive took about an hour and a half. The last stretch was a cracked, uneven road that wound through tall pines. When I finally reached the trailhead, there were no other cars. The wooden sign marking the start of the path looked faded, almost like no one had maintained it in years. That should have been my first warning sign, but I told myself it was perfect. Quiet, No crowds, just me and the woods. I parked, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The first mile was easy, a dirt path with rocks poking through, leaves crunching underfoot. The air smelled sharp and clean. I felt good. But as I moved deeper into the trees, I started to notice how quiet it was. Usually on trails you can hear things. Birds calling, insects buzzing, wind moving branches. Here it felt muffled, like the forest was holding its breath. Every sound I made seemed too loud. The snap of a twig under my boot echoed longer than it should have. I kept walking, trying not to think about it. After maybe 3 miles, the trail grew less clear. Fallen leaves covered much of it, and branches blocked the way in some spots. I had to push through thick undergrowth that scratched my arms. I checked my phone a couple of times, making sure the GPS still tracked my location. The trail line on the map showed I was still on it, so I kept moving. Around noon, I reached a steep section that wound up the side of the ridge. The climb left me sweaty and breathing hard, but when I reached the top, the view opened wide. The valley stretched below, dotted with trees fading into fall colors. Farther out, the mountains rose blue and hazy. I dropped my pack, sat on a flat rock, and ate one of the granola bars. The sun warmed my face, and for a moment, I felt like the trip had been worth it. I stayed there about half an hour before I decided to head back. That was when things started to go wrong. I walked back down the ridge, retracing my steps. But after a while, the trail didn't look right. The undergrowth was thicker, the ground softer, as if it had rained recently, though I hadn't seen mud on the way up. I checked my phone again. The GPS dot blinked a little off from the trail line. I figured I'd just stepped off the path and could cut back to it easily. I kept moving, turning where I thought the trail should be. But the more I walked, the more lost I felt. The trees looked the same in every direction, tall and straight with dark bark. I didn't see the same broken branches I had pushed through earlier, or the same clusters of rocks. I stopped and tried to calm myself. I wasn't that far from the ridge, maybe a mile or 2. If I backtracked carefully, I could find my way. I turned around and followed what I thought was my trail, but after 20 minutes, nothing looked familiar. The quiet pressed in heavier now. Even my footsteps seemed swallowed by the forest floor. I couldn't hear a single bird. I checked my phone again. The battery had dropped faster than I expected, down to 70% already. The map showed me as a blue dot floating in blank space, no longer on any trail line. I tried to zoom out, but the map froze and took too long to load. My stomach tightened. I kept walking. The hours blurred. The sun shifted lower, and the light changed from gold to pale gray. I realized I hadn't seen anything man-made for miles. No signs, no trail markers, not even old footprints. Just trees and more trees. I stopped near a fallen log to drink water and eat another bar. That was when I noticed something that chilled me more than being lost. A pile of bones scattered in the leaves. They were small, maybe from a deer or a large dog, picked clean. Some of them had been cracked open. The skull lay on its side, empty sockets staring. I told myself it was just nature, predators doing what they do, but my hands shook as I packed up again. The sun kept sinking. By the time I realized I should have turned around hours ago, it was too late. The forest dimmed, shadows stretching long. I pulled out my flashlight, the small beam cutting through the trees, but it only made me feel more trapped. My phone was down to 30%. No signal, just the same useless blue dot in a blank space. I tried to keep my bearings, moving downhill, thinking it might lead me back to a road or river, but the terrain grew steeper, rocks slick with moss. At one point, my boots slipped and I crashed to my knees, skin scraping raw. I swore under my breath, the sound vanishing into the silence. Night fell heavy. The temperature dropped fast, the kind of chill that sank into my bones. I wrapped my hoodie tighter and kept the flashlight low. Every rustle in the leaves made me freeze, heart pounding. I couldn't see what made the noises, maybe rabbits, maybe nothing at all, but they always seemed just out of sight. At some point, exhaustion set in. I stumbled through the dark until I found a small clearing, barely wide enough to sit. I leaned against a tree, pulling my knees up, trying to stay warm. The ground was hard, roots digging into my back. I kept the flashlight on, afraid to switch it off, though the battery ticked lower every minute. I didn't sleep much. My eyes shut in brief, uneasy spells, but every time I jerked awake, the forest felt closer, like the trees had shifted while I rested. When the gray light of dawn finally seeped through the branches, I pushed myself up, sore and stiff. My throat felt dry, lips cracked. I checked my water, only one bottle left. My phone was at 10%. I forced myself to keep moving downhill. Hours passed. My legs ached, my stomach hollow, but I pushed on. Eventually, I heard something I hadn't heard in over a day: water. I followed the faint sound until I reached a narrow stream cutting through the forest. Relief almost made me drop to my knees. I crouched, cupped water in my hands, and drank, ignoring the risk of sickness. The cold water slid down my throat like life itself. I walked along the stream, hoping it would lead somewhere. The banks twisted and climbed, but I stayed with it. Then I saw something that froze me in place. A torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch over the water. It looked faded, frayed at the edges, maybe from a jacket or backpack. Not mine. Someone else had been here before me. I picked it up, turned it over, then let it drop. My chest tightened. If someone else had come through here, what happened to them? The stream carried me farther downhill until the trees began to thin. My hope rose, and then, through the gaps, I saw a flash of something unnatural. Straight lines, gray color. A road. I broke into a staggering run, crashing through brush until I reached the edge of asphalt. It wasn't a main road, just a cracked, narrow lane cutting between the trees, but it was enough. I followed it for nearly 2 miles before I saw a parked truck outside a small cabin. Relief flooded me so hard my knees almost buckled. I knew I was safe. That hike should have been simple, a quiet walk up a ridge and back. Instead, I spent almost 2 days lost in woods that felt like they didn't want me to leave. I still think about the silence sometimes, the bones, the fabric on the branch, the way the forest seemed to swallow me whole. I haven't gone hiking alone since. I was 26 when I decided to take that hike alone, though now I wish I had never stepped foot on that trail. It was the summer of 2016, in northern Colorado, far away from the usual tourist spots. I had moved to Denver for work just a year earlier, and most of my free weekends were spent trying to escape the noise of the city. Hiking had become my way of shutting everything out, a way of stretching my lungs with fresh air, clearing my head, and testing my body. I liked the feeling of being completely alone with nothing but the sound of dirt under my boots and wind through the trees. That Saturday started early. I left my small apartment around 5 a.m. The sun was only beginning to brighten the horizon as I drove out of the city. I had chosen a less popular trail called Bear Creek Ridge, about 2 hours northwest. It wasn't famous or crowded like some others, which is exactly why I picked it. I wanted quiet. Online reviews said it was about 12 miles in and 12 out, mostly steady incline, with one long stretch that wasn't marked well. That part should have been a warning sign, but I brushed it off. By 7:30, I had parked my car on the gravel turnout. There were no other cars around. That should have made me pause too, but instead, I felt lucky. The air was cool and smelled of pine. The dirt lot was uneven, and the forest around it looked thick and untouched. I pulled on my pack, tightened the straps, double-checked my water bottles, and locked the car. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow, sometimes overgrown with weeds that brushed against my shins. Birds called from somewhere deep in the trees. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the leaves and lighting up patches of moss. My boots crunched on loose gravel. The air grew warmer, and sweat began to bead on my back where the straps of my pack rubbed against me. The incline was steady, and by mile 4, my thighs burned in a familiar way. I didn't mind, it was part of why I hiked. I checked my watch now and then, keeping a slow but consistent pace. At around mile 5, I stopped at a small clearing where a log lay across the trail. I drank half a bottle of water and ate a granola bar. The forest was silent except for the faint trickle of water somewhere nearby. I remember glancing around and feeling a small prickle in my stomach. The trees here grew denser, taller. The sky seemed farther away. There was no breeze. I thought about how completely alone I was. The feeling wasn't fear, not yet, but something like alertness. I shrugged it off and kept walking. The trail narrowed further around mile 7. Branches hung low, forcing me to duck. Roots tangled across the dirt, and I had to watch every step. At one point, I tripped and caught myself against a tree, scraping my hand on the bark. The sting grounded me. I wiped the dirt off on my shorts and moved on. By the time I reached mile 9, the trail had started to fade. I remembered the online reviews mentioning this. The dirt path split into 2 faint tracks, both leading uphill. I chose the one on the right since it looked more worn. I told myself I'd be fine. I had water, food, and daylight. But within 15 minutes, I knew I had made the wrong choice. The trail vanished. There was no sign of a worn path, only patches of bare ground between thick shrubs. I stopped, trying to steady my breathing. I turned slowly, scanning for a marker or a cut in the trees, but everything looked the same. I retraced my steps for a while, but I couldn't find the split again. My boots sank into soft earth, leaves crunched underfoot, and branches snapped against my shoulders. I pulled out my phone, but of course there was no signal. The GPS map I had downloaded showed only a green blur with a blue dot in the middle. Useless. I told myself not to panic. I still had plenty of daylight. I could backtrack until I found the main trail. But backtracking in thick woods isn't simple. Every tree looks like the last. The sun had shifted, and shadows stretched in strange directions. I walked faster, my heart pounding harder. Minutes passed, then an hour. My watch said it was almost noon, and I still hadn't found the trail. The silence pressed in heavy, broken only by my labored breathing and the crunch of my boots. Sweat ran down my spine. My water was half gone. Then I heard it, a sound that froze me where I stood. Not an animal, not wind, something heavy moving through brush behind me. Slow, steady, like footsteps. I turned, my eyes scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The forest stood still, dark and crowded. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a bear, but the steps had sounded even too deliberate. I started walking again, faster this time. My boots slipped on loose dirt. Branches clawed at my arms. I didn't look back for several minutes, afraid of what I might see. Finally, I stopped to listen. My chest rose and fell, loud in the silence. Nothing. No steps. Only the distant call of a crow. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I had to think. Panic would get me killed faster than being lost. I took out my compass, but the thick canopy made it hard to trust direction. Still, I picked what I thought was south and kept moving. Another hour passed. My throat was dry, my legs ached, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. Couldn't shake it. The forest was too quiet, unnaturally so. No rustle of small animals, no insects buzzing. Just my own footsteps and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere behind me. At one point, I came across a small clearing. In the center was an old fire pit, blackened stones arranged in a circle, charred wood inside. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here before, maybe recently. I crouched down and touched the ashes. Cold, but not ancient. Maybe a week old. I stood quickly, scanning the tree line. Whoever had built this might still come here. The thought sent a chill through me. I decided not to linger. I pushed on, choosing a narrow gap in the trees. My pack felt heavier with every step. My water was running low. By mid-afternoon, clouds rolled in, dimming the light. The forest grew darker, cooler. I stumbled more often, catching my boots on roots. The feeling of being followed never left. Sometimes, I thought I heard faint movement far behind me, like someone pacing their steps with mine, staying just out of sight. Around 4 p.m., I finally broke through to a slope that overlooked a narrow valley. Relief hit me for a moment. I could see farther, open space instead of endless trees. But the valley stretched on with no sign of a road, no cabins, nothing man-made. Only forest as far as I could see. I sat on a rock, drank the last of one water bottle, and tried not to think about the growing shadows. I had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. I needed to find a safe place before dark. That's when I saw it. On the opposite slope, half hidden by trees, was a structure. A cabin or maybe an old shed. My heart leapt. Shelter. Maybe even people. I didn't hesitate. I climbed down into the valley, slipping on loose dirt, grabbing branches to steady myself. It took nearly 40 minutes to reach the base and start up the other side. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I pushed harder. The structure grew clearer through the trees. It was a cabin. Small, weathered, the wood gray with age. The roof sagged. No smoke rose from a chimney. When I reached it, I stopped a few feet away. The cabin looked abandoned. Windows broken, door slightly ajar. The air around it felt still, heavier than the forest. I thought of turning back, but I had no better option. Night was coming, and I couldn't spend it exposed in the woods. I pushed the door open slowly. The hinges groaned. Inside, dust floated in dim light. A single room, wooden table, 2 chairs, an old stove. Cobwebs stretched across the corners. The floor creaked under my weight. I dropped my pack and sat on the floor against the wall, exhaustion flooding me. My plan was simple. Rest, wait out the night, and at dawn try again to find the main trail. But as the light outside dimmed, the unease returned sharper than before. I felt exposed inside that cabin, like the walls weren't protection but a trap. Every creak of the wood made me tense. I thought again of the footsteps I'd heard earlier. As darkness fell, I pulled out my flashlight. The beam cut across the room, catching dust and empty corners. I tried to eat a protein bar, but my stomach churned too much to swallow. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Movement outside. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. My body went rigid. I killed the flashlight, holding my breath. The steps crunched on dry leaves, then paused. Silence stretched thin, unbearable. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down I knew better. The weight of those steps, the rhythm, they belonged to a person. Someone was out there, moving in the dark, just beyond the walls. I didn't sleep at all. I sat with my back against the wall, knife from my pack in hand. I had been hiking for years, but that summer of 2018, I felt the itch to push myself harder. I was 28, working a dull office job in Karachi that left me drained most days, and I needed a break. Nature always cleared my head. I'd done day hikes around the Margalla Hills countless times, but I wanted something longer, rougher, something that would feel like a small test. I planned a solo hike along a route in northern Pakistan, a trail that wound through forested valleys and climbed into steep ridges where the air was cooler and the trees grew thick and close. It wasn't the most popular path, which was exactly why I chose it. The map I studied showed a stretch from the edge of a small town up into the hills, then a loop that passed by an old logging road before circling back. It looked manageable, but the notes I found online warned that parts of it were unmarked, overgrown, and easy to lose if you weren't careful. That didn't bother me. I prided myself on paying attention, keeping track of landmarks, and pacing myself. I left on a Friday afternoon in late August, taking a bus north, then a rickety van into the town closest to the trail. The air was different there, thinner and cooler. I bought a few last supplies, extra water, dried food, batteries, and stayed one night in a cheap roadside guest house. The walls were thin, the fan rattled all night, but I barely slept anyway. I felt wired with a mix of excitement and nerves. The next morning, I started early. The first stretch was familiar enough. Dusty tracks winding between scattered houses, the smell of wood smoke hanging low in the air. A few kids stared as I passed, but no one paid me much mind. Within an hour, the houses thinned out and the trail narrowed. The trees grew thicker, tall pines standing like dark pillars on both sides. The silence came gradually. At first, I still heard the faint sound of the town behind me. An engine, a dog barking. But soon it was swallowed by the weight of the forest. My boots crunched on dry soil and fallen needles. Every now and then, a bird startled out of the branches, the quick beating of wings cutting through the stillness. I walked for hours, climbing steadily. The path was marked with old paint on rocks, though some had faded. I kept checking my map, noting a crooked tree here, a fallen log there, small details to anchor myself. The higher I went, the more tangled the undergrowth became. Ferns and bushes pressed in close, brushing against my legs. The light dimmed as the canopy thickened, and the air smelled sharp, resinous. By noon, I reached a small clearing where sunlight broke through, and I sat on a rock to eat. The quiet was deep, almost heavy. No human sound at all, just the faint whisper of wind in the branches. I chewed slowly, drinking water, staring at the lines of trees leading uphill. For a moment, it felt as if I were the last person left alive, like the world outside the forest had slipped away. After resting, I pushed on. The trail narrowed further, twisting through gullies and climbing over roots. I sweated hard, my shirt clinging to my back. I kept glancing at my watch, measuring my pace. I wanted to reach the logging road by late afternoon, then loop back and camp somewhere near a stream marked on the map. That had been my plan. But sometime around mid-afternoon, the trail blurred. I came to a fork where the markings were gone, just two narrow tracks threading off in different directions. I stopped, frowning, scanning the trees. I thought the right path looked slightly more worn, so I took it. For a while it felt fine, climbing steadily, but after 20 minutes I realized nothing matched the map. There should have been a bend with a boulder, but all I saw were trees. I told myself not to worry. Trails can change. I pushed on, marking the time in my head. Another 20 minutes, and I reached a slope choked with undergrowth. I scrambled up, sweating, my legs scratched raw. When I reached the top, I froze. There was no path, just endless trees stretching out, uneven ground, patches of bramble. I turned, scanning for the way back, but everything looked the same. The trail I'd come up had vanished behind thick brush. A cold prickling ran down my spine. I forced myself to breathe slow. Getting lost was always a risk, but panic was worse. I tried to retrace, pushing back down the slope, but after a few minutes I couldn't tell if I was on the same track or not. My footprints were lost in dry soil and pine needles. The forest pressed in on all sides. The trunks were close together, the ground sloping unpredictably. Every direction looked the same. Dark wood, tangled roots, patches of shadow where the light couldn't reach. My chest felt tight. I stopped to think. I still had food, water, a flashlight, a compass. The sun was high but sinking. If I stayed calm, I could reorient. I pulled out the compass, checked the map, and tried to line up the direction of the logging road. West. If I kept west, eventually I'd hit it. So I walked, step after step, pushing through undergrowth, ducking under branches, sliding down ridges slick with old leaves. The air grew cooler as the sun dropped. Shadows lengthened, and the silence deepened until even the birds stopped. After an hour, my legs ached, but still no road. Just trees, ridges, gullies. I started to notice small details repeating. A split tree with pale bark, a cluster of rocks shaped like a triangle. Had I circled back without realizing? The fear crept in slowly, like water seeping under a door. At first it was irritation, then unease, then the sharp, cold edge of dread. I was alone in a forest that stretched for miles, with no trail, no landmarks I trusted, and the sun was dropping fast. By evening the light was fading, and the forest changed. The green dimmed to gray, the trunks blackened, the undergrowth turned into shadowy shapes. The air cooled sharply, and the silence grew heavier. Every sound stood out. A twig snapping under my boot, the rustle of leaves, the distant creak of branches. I picked a small flat spot near a cluster of rocks and decided to stop. Moving further in the dark would be suicide. I dropped my pack, pulled out my sleeping bag and food, and tried to settle. I chewed a dry biscuit slowly, the taste chalky in my mouth, forcing myself to drink little sips of water. But the forest didn't sleep. In the dark, it came alive in a different way. Small movements at the edge of hearing, soft rustles, faint cracks of branches. Once I heard a sharp sound, like something stepping on dry wood, too heavy for a bird. I froze, every muscle tight, ears straining. But the sound faded, leaving only silence. I lay awake for hours, eyes darting at the shifting shadows, my flashlight clutched in one hand. The beam seemed weak against the blackness, only lighting a narrow cone while the rest of the forest loomed unseen. My heart thumped with every noise, real or imagined. When sleep finally came, it was shallow, broken by sudden jolts awake. At one point I thought I heard breathing close by, but when I snapped the light around, nothing moved. My skin crawled, but I told myself it was just my own fear echoing back at me. At dawn I rose, stiff and exhausted. The forest looked different again, pale light filtering through mist, trunks standing like silent figures. My stomach churned with hunger, but I forced myself to eat. I needed strength. I tried again to head west. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then shifted, but the trees never ended. I tripped more often, my legs burning, scratches stinging my arms. I rationed water, counting each sip. By afternoon, I felt dizzy, my head pounding. That was when I saw it. An old fire pit, black stones in a circle, half buried under leaves. Someone had camped here once. Relief surged through me, sharp and blinding. It meant people had been here. It meant I wasn't completely lost in some untouched void. I searched the area, hoping for a trail, but found nothing. Just the pit, cold and long and used. The relief faded, replaced by a hollow ache. Whoever had been here was long gone. The second night was worse. Hunger gnawed at me, and the forest seemed louder. I heard more steps, faint and irregular, always at the edge of hearing. My nerves frayed. I gripped my flashlight until my hand cramped. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a darker shape slipping behind a trunk, but when I blinked, it was gone. Maybe my mind was twisting shadows into threats. On the third day, I woke weak, my throat dry, my body heavy. My water was nearly gone. I stumbled more than walked, scraping knees, tearing my palms on bark. I kept moving west, though west felt meaningless now. The sun overhead was my only guide, and even it vanished behind the canopy at times. Late that afternoon, I broke through into a clearing. My breath caught. There, running across the far side, was a dirt track. Wide, flattened, unmistakable, a road. I staggered. I was 26 the year it happened, living in a small rented apartment on the east side of Flagstaff, Arizona. I had just switched jobs, and everything in my life felt like it was stuck in between. I was working long shifts at a warehouse, mostly stacking boxes and hauling things around, but I wanted something more. To clear my head, I had started hiking every weekend. Sometimes it was short trails near town, sometimes longer trips up in the San Francisco peaks. I didn't care about taking photos or posting online like most hikers did. I just wanted the silence, the steady rhythm of walking, the feeling of leaving everything behind for a while. It was the second weekend of September 2017 when I decided to go out on my own to a trail I had read about in an old out-of-print guidebook. The book had been published in the late 80s, and the trail it mentioned wasn't listed on any of the newer maps. It was supposed to be an old logging road that climbed up the side of Kendrick Peak, then cut off through thick forest toward an abandoned fire lookout. I liked the sound of it. Remote, quiet, away from the crowded routes where everyone else went. I left my apartment before sunrise, threw my pack in the back seat, and drove north. The roads were nearly empty. The sky was pale gray, the kind of morning where the air feels cold and sharp in your lungs. I stopped once for gas and coffee, then kept driving past the familiar trailheads. After about an hour, I reached the dirt road that was supposed to lead me toward the start of the forgotten trail. The road was rough, full of ruts and rocks. My old Honda Civic wasn't built for it, but I managed, taking it slow, the car rocking and scraping underneath more than once. After about 4 miles of bouncing around, I reached a small pull-off that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Broken glass glinted in the dirt, and weeds had grown tall through cracks in the ground. I parked, killed the engine, and stepped out. The silence hit me right away. No cars, no people, not even the faint sound of airplanes overhead. Just stillness, broken by the occasional dry rasp of wind through pine needles. I shouldered my pack, tightened the straps, and started down the trail. At first, it looked just like the book had described. A wide, grassy road cutting through the forest, lined with ponderosa pines on both sides. The air smelled like sun-warmed sap and old dirt. I walked quickly, enjoying the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, the steady pull of the straps on my shoulders. After a mile or two, the road narrowed. Grass grew waist-high in the center, and branches clawed at my arms as I pushed forward. I could tell no one had maintained it in decades, but it was still clear enough to follow, so I pressed on, convinced that I would find the old fire lookout the book had mentioned. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, slanting through the trees in long golden beams. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat, and my water bottle grew lighter. I checked my watch. Almost noon. That was when I noticed the first strange thing. The trail curved left around a cluster of boulders, and for the first time all morning, I saw something that didn't belong. In the dirt ahead of me were tire tracks. Not fresh, but not ancient either. The grooves were shallow, worn down, but visible enough to know a vehicle had been there in the last few years. I crouched down, running my hand over the marks. They disappeared into the grass a few feet later, as if the vehicle had veered off and vanished. Struck me as odd. There was no way a car could have made it this far down the overgrown path. Not without serious damage. Maybe it had been some kind of ATV, I thought. Still, something about it unsettled me. I stood, adjusted my pack, and kept going. The further I went, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed to disappear. The trees thickened, pressing close around me, their branches forming a tangled ceiling that blocked out most of the sky. My boots sank into soft, black soil, and the air grew cooler, damp with the smell of rot and moss. I checked my watch again. Nearly 2 p.m. I had been walking for hours, but there was no sign of a lookout tower, no open clearing, nothing but endless forest and the faint, narrowing trail. My legs ached, and a dull unease settled in my chest. I thought about turning back, but stubbornness kept me moving. I told myself the lookout had to be close, maybe just another mile, maybe right over the next ridge. That was when I noticed the second strange thing. At first I thought it was trash, a flash of color in the dirt up ahead. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't trash at all. It was a jacket, a faded blue windbreaker, half buried in leaves and mud. The fabric was torn at the shoulder, as if it had been caught on something. I crouched down, pulled it free. It was heavy with moisture, smelled faintly of mildew. Inside one pocket was a lighter, rusted and useless. In the other, a small, crumpled receipt. The print had mostly faded, but I could just make out a date. July 2003. I froze. 14 years ago. Who leaves a jacket in the middle of nowhere and never comes back for it? I dropped it quickly, suddenly aware of how alone I was. My throat felt tight, and the silence pressed against my ears. I wanted to go back. Every part of me screamed to turn around. But something else, curiosity, stupidity, I don't know, kept me moving forward. The trail grew worse. Roots snagged at my boots. Branches slapped across my face. At one point, I lost the path entirely and had to circle in wide loops until I found it again, my heart hammering the whole time. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone there, though the trail was always empty. By the time I reached the clearing, it was nearly 5 p.m. It wasn't the fire lookout I found, not even close. The trail opened into a flat, grassy space maybe the size of a basketball court. In the center stood a small wooden structure, old and leaning, its roof caved in on one side. It looked like a cabin, though it was too small to live in. More like a shack, maybe for tools or equipment. I stood at the edge of the clearing, staring. Something about it made my stomach twist. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no fire. I stepped closer. The door hung crooked, barely attached to the frame. The wood was gray with age, rough beneath my hand as I pushed it open. Inside was darkness. The roof leaked light in thin, dusty beams. The floor was littered with broken boards, fallen shingles, and leaves that had blown in over the years. Against the far wall stood a rusted metal bed frame. Beside it, a wooden crate. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the debris. The air was thick, damp, heavy with the smell of rot. When I reached the crate, I hesitated. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside were cans. Old food cans, stacked neatly, their labels faded to nothing. Next to them lay something worse. A backpack. It was torn open, its zippers rusted, its fabric stained with dark blotches I didn't want to name. Inside were scraps of clothing, a shoe, a cracked plastic water bottle. I staggered back, my chest tight, my mind racing. Whoever had left the jacket, whoever had used this shack, they hadn't come back. I stumbled outside, gasping for air. The clearing spun around me. I wanted to run, to get as far from that place as I could. But the trail back was long, tangled, fading fast in the dimming light. Panic clawed at me as I realized how late it was. The sun had dipped low, painting the trees in long shadows. Night would fall soon, and I was miles from my car. I forced myself to move, to retrace my steps, though every sound in the forest now felt like it was following me. A crack of a branch, a shuffle in the underbrush, the faint rustle of leaves. My brain turned each into footsteps. I didn't stop, not to eat, not to drink, not even to rest. I walked until my legs shook beneath me, until the trail blurred in the dark. I fumbled with my flashlight, its weak beam bouncing wildly across the trees. At some point, I lost the path again. The forest closed in, a wall of black trunks and clawing branches. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest burning. I spun in circles, the beam of my light catching only endless woods. I don't know how long I wandered. An hour, maybe two. My watch had stopped working, the second hand frozen. My flashlight dimmed, flickered, went out. I thought I was done. I thought I would spend the night out there, shivering in the dirt, waiting for morning. But then, by some miracle, I saw it. A faint glow through the trees. Not a flashlight, not a fire, just the pale silver light of the moon breaking through the canopy. And beneath it, grass flattened into the faint line of the trail. I stumbled toward it, half blind, my throat raw from breathing so hard. I followed it, step after step, until finally, I broke free of the trees and saw the faint outline of my car through the darkness. I didn't look back, not once. I threw my I had been planning the trip for weeks. The idea was simple. Get away from the noise of the city, shut out the constant notifications and traffic, and just disappear into the quiet for a while. It was late September of 2017. I was 26 years old, and my job had been grinding me down for months. Hiking alone wasn't new to me, though most of the time I kept to well-marked trails. This time I wanted something different, something that felt raw. I picked a trail in northern Montana, outside the usual tourist flow, the kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another soul. The forest there wasn't like the neat, trimmed parks near the city. It was rough, uneven, and heavy with thick pine, the kind of land where once you step in, you realize just how small you are compared to everything around you. I left my car at a small gravel turnout, no official parking lot, just a place where hunters or loggers probably pulled off sometimes. The sun was already pushing down by the time I started. Late afternoon light that made the tops of the trees look golden while the ground below stayed cool and shadowed. My backpack was heavy, but I had packed carefully. A small tent, sleeping bag, food sealed in bags, water bottles, a filter pump, first aid kit, knife, flashlight, and spare batteries. I carried a map folded into a plastic sleeve, and in my pocket, a compass I trusted more than any phone signal. I had checked coverage out here. It was spotty, unreliable. That was part of why I came. The trail was faint, more like a deer path that had been worn down in certain places. Every step felt like I was moving deeper into something untouched. The air smelled of sap and damp earth. Occasionally, I heard the distant crack of branches, maybe deer moving, or the wind shifting through the canopy. The further I went, the quieter it seemed to get. By the time I had been walking 2 hours, the sound of the road was gone completely. No cars, no voices, no engines. Just the steady crunch of my boots against dirt and scattered leaves. I pushed hard because I wanted to set camp before dusk. My plan was to hike about 6 miles in, find a flat spot, and settle for the night. But the trail twisted longer than I expected, and the terrain was rougher. Slopes, fallen trees, muddy patches that sucked at my boots. By the time the light started dimming, I hadn't reached my intended point. That's when the unease began. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow drip of awareness. The trees felt closer, the air thicker. My sense of direction stayed steady. I checked the compass often, but I started to notice small things. A bird call that stopped too quick. A branch snapping just out of sight. The smell of soil stronger than before, almost metallic. I found a flat spot near a stream and decided to stop. It wasn't perfect, but I didn't want to be fumbling with stakes and rope in total darkness. I dropped my pack, stretched my aching shoulders, and set up the tent. The nylon rustled sharp against the silence. I boiled water, ate a quick meal, and sat for a while listening. That's when I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The forest was too quiet. I had been in plenty of woods before, and even at night there were always sounds. Crickets, owls, something moving in the underbrush. But here, as darkness folded over, everything seemed to shut down. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was the season, maybe the temperature drop. I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and laid down in my bag. The fabric muffled the world outside, but I still felt it, that weight pressing in from every direction. I told myself sleep would come once my body calmed from the long hike. But hours passed and I kept waking up. Sometimes it was a sound, a faint scrape, a shift of gravel outside. Sometimes it was nothing, just the sudden sense that I wasn't alone. At one point, I thought I heard slow steps circling the tent. I held my breath, every muscle frozen. The sound faded, or maybe I convinced myself it had. By dawn, I was exhausted. My eyes ached, and my throat was dry. When I unzipped the tent, the air outside was cold enough to sting. The stream trickled steady nearby. The sunlight slanted pale through the trees. Everything looked normal. Nothing seemed disturbed. My mind tried to tell me it had all been nerves, fatigue playing tricks. I ate a quick breakfast and packed up, but something inside me had already shifted. The hike no longer felt like an escape. It felt like something I needed to get through. I was 27 when I decided to take that hike. It was late September of 2018, and I remember the morning clearly, though I wish I didn't. The air was cool enough that I could see my breath when I stepped out of the car, and the parking lot was almost empty. A single truck sat at the far end, but no one was around. The sky was pale blue, stretched thin, with a faint haze over the treeline. The trail I'd chosen wasn't supposed to be dangerous. It wasn't remote, not compared to some of the other places I'd been. It was listed as moderate on the website, about 8 miles round trip, looping through pine forest and ridges, with a viewpoint over the valley. I had done harder, longer hikes before. This was meant to be nothing more than a way to clear my head. I remember adjusting the straps of my pack, tightening the waist belt until it dug into my sides. Inside I had the basics: a liter of water, some trail mix, a flashlight, a folded windbreaker, and a small first aid kit. Nothing fancy. I left my phone in airplane mode to save the battery, figuring I'd check it once I was back. The reception was unreliable anyway. The first section of the trail was wide, almost like a dirt road. The ground was dry and packed, scattered with needles from the pines that lined either side. The trunk stood straight and close, making the path feel like a hallway through the woods. The only sound was the crunch of my boots and the faint stir of wind. It smelled of sap and dry earth. For the first mile, everything was fine. My breathing was steady, my pace strong. Sunlight broke through the branches here and there, lighting up dust motes that drifted in the air. I passed trail markers nailed to trees, bright orange triangles that reassured me I was on the right track. But around the second mile, the trail began to narrow. Roots broke through the dirt, twisted and exposed like veins. The incline increased as the path wound uphill. I slowed my pace, not out of exhaustion but from caution. The silence of the woods pressed in. No voices, no birdsong, just the faint rustle of branches and the occasional sound of something small moving through the undergrowth. I stopped once to sip water and looked around. The forest felt heavier here. The trees blocked most of the sunlight, and the ground was damp in places, soft with moss. My boots left dark impressions with each step. It was when I hit the ridgeline that things began to feel off. The path became rocky, broken by jagged stones that shifted under my weight. To my left, the land sloped sharply downward into a thicket of brush and fallen trees. To my right, the ridge rose up like a wall. There was no room to stray from the path. The air was still, almost unnaturally so. I told myself it was fine, just another hike, just another trail. But I started noticing things. Small things at first. A glove on the ground, weathered and stiff with dirt, too worn to have been dropped recently. A dent in the trunk of a tree, like someone had struck it hard with a blade or a hatchet. A length of rope half buried under leaves, frayed at one end. Each thing on its own meant nothing. People lost items. Trees bore scars from storms. Rope ended up in odd places, but together they unsettled me. I pressed on. The trail wound higher, curving through boulders. The footing grew trickier, and I had to use my hands a few times to steady myself. My breath came heavier. Sweat gathered at the base of my neck despite the cool air. At the 4th mile marker, the path split. One section sloped down into thicker forest, while the other climbed sharply toward the summit. Both were marked. Both were legitimate trails. I hesitated, then chose the climb. I wanted the view from the top. I wanted proof that the hike had been worth it. The trail grew rougher. Sections were barely visible, just faint clearings in the brush. I stopped more often, checking the ground for signs of footprints. Most looked old, faded by rain and time. My unease deepened. I told myself I'd turn back after the viewpoint. Just get there, take a moment and return. But when I reached what should have been the top, there was no view. Only trees, dense, thick, stretching endlessly. I checked my phone, but the GPS was useless without reception. The map I'd printed showed the loop clearly, but the lines didn't match what I saw around me. I tried to follow the trail anyway, trusting the markers. That's when I noticed the first one missing. The orange triangles that had been nailed to trees every few hundred feet were gone. I walked further, scanning trunks, but none appeared. The path beneath my boots faded until it was nothing but uneven ground littered with branches. I stopped. The forest was silent again. Too silent. I turned in a slow circle, trying to get my bearings. Every direction looked the same. Pines, brush, shadow. My pulse quickened. I knew better than to panic. Panic would waste energy, cloud my mind. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to focus. I decided to retrace my steps, backtrack until I found the last clear marker. But as I walked, the ground betrayed me. The ridge sloped in ways I hadn't noticed before, funneling me downward into gullies. I tried to keep track of landmarks, a split tree, a moss-covered boulder, but everything blended. I walked for what felt like an hour before realizing I was only deeper in. That's when I saw the first campsite. At first it looked abandoned, just a scatter of gear half hidden by leaves. A collapsed tent, its fabric shredded. A rusted stove tipped on its side. A backpack with the straps chewed through. I crouched to look closer, heart hammering. The gear was old. Not decades old, but not fresh either. The metal was rusted, the fabric stiff. It had been here at least a few years. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there, staring, trying to make sense of it. Someone had camped here and left in a hurry, leaving everything behind. I moved on quickly, forcing my legs to keep going. But then I found another, and another, different camps scattered through the woods, all abandoned, all in varying states of decay. Some with fire rings choked with ash and moss, others with tarps sagging under fallen branches. One had a sleeping bag still inside the tent, ripped open down the middle as if cut. By the time I reached the fifth one, my stomach was tight with dread. I didn't know what I was walking through anymore. The forest began to feel hostile. The silence wasn't empty now, it was watchful. Every step sounded too loud, every snap of a twig like a gunshot. I felt exposed, as if eyes were on me from the dark spaces between the trees. I forced myself to stop and think. My best chance was to find running water. Streams usually led downhill, and downhill meant valleys, which meant roads or towns eventually. I listened hard and thought I heard a faint trickle in the distance. I moved toward it. The ground grew wetter, sucking at my boots. The air smelled of rot. Fallen branches crisscrossed my path, and I had to climb over them, scratching my arms on bark. Finally, I saw the glint of water. A narrow stream wound through the forest, shallow but moving. Relief washed over me. I crouched and filled my bottle, filtering it as best I could. The water was cold and sharp against my tongue. I followed the stream, keeping it to my right, hoping it would guide me out. But as the light faded, my hope began to unravel. The stream twisted endlessly, doubling back, vanishing under thickets only to reappear yards later. It felt like it was leading me in circles. The forest grew darker, shadows pooling deep. I checked my watch. Nearly 7 in the evening. Sunset would come soon, and with it the cold. I needed shelter. I pushed through the brush until I found a small clearing. Not much, just a flat space between 2 leaning pines. I dropped my pack, my hands shaking. I gathered what branches I could and managed to get a small fire going with the lighter I always carried. The flames were weak, sputtering in the damp air, but they gave me light and a fragile sense of safety. I sat there for hours, knees pulled to my chest, watching the trees. Every rustle made me flinch. At one point, I thought I saw movement just beyond the firelight, a darker shape sliding between trunks. I froze, staring until my eyes watered, but nothing emerged. I didn't sleep, couldn't. I just sat there, waiting for morning. When the first pale light came, I wasted no time. I stamped out the fire and shouldered my pack. My muscles ached from sitting still, and my throat was raw with thirst. I followed the stream again, forcing myself onward. The second day blurred. I walked for hours, stumbling, tripping, cutting my hands on branches. My mind grew hazy with exhaustion. I saw more signs, more old camps, more abandoned gear. At one point, I found a knife stuck into a tree, the blade rusted. Nearby, a torn jacket lay crumpled in the dirt, dark stains on the fabric. I didn't look too closely at the stains. By the third day, my body was breaking down.